The rain hammered against the windows of Manhattan's most exclusive law firm as 7 children sat in oversized leather chairs, their dirty sneakers barely touching the marble floor. Social workers whispered in corners. Lawyers shuffled papers, with barely concealed disgust. And somewhere in the city, the man who had just changed their lives forever lay dying in a hospital bed, his final wish about to unleash a chain of events that would expose secrets worth killing for. "He's lost his mind," the lawyers had said. "Terminal cancer has clearly affected his judgment." But what nobody knew, not the social workers, not the legal team, not even the children themselves, was that billionaire Marcus Thompson had been planning this moment for 30 years. And the 7 street kids he'd just adopted weren't random at all. They were the key to everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Thompson Industries headquarters pierced the Manhattan skyline like a glass and steel monument to American capitalism. 47 floors of gleaming offices, conference rooms where billion-dollar deals were struck with handshakes, and at the very top, a penthouse office that commanded a view of the entire city. For 35 years, Marcus Thompson had ruled. This empire with an iron fist and a brilliant mind that could see opportunities where others saw only obstacles. But empires built on shadows carry dark secrets, and Marcus Thompson's was no exception. At 68 years old, Marcus had everything money could buy except time. The pancreatic cancer diagnosis had come 6 months ago, delivered by Dr. Patricia Williams, in the same sterile tone she might use to discuss the weather. 6 months, maybe 8 if you're lucky. I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson. Marcus had simply nodded, thanked the doctor, and walked out of Mount Sinai Hospital with the same composed expression he wore during hostile takeovers. But inside, something had shifted. The ticking clock that every man hears but chooses to ignore had suddenly become deafeningly loud. That night, he'd sat in his Fifth Avenue penthouse, a sprawling 12,000-square-foot monument to his success, and made a decision that would have shocked anyone who thought they knew him. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he'd memorized but never called. "Detective Sarah Rodriguez, this is Marcus Thompson. I think it's time we talked about the Riverside Children's Home fire, the real story." The silence on the other end had stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Rodriguez finally spoke. "Mr. Thompson, that case was closed 27 years ago. 7 children died, and we never found who was responsible." "I know who was responsible," Marcus had said quietly, "because I've been looking for the survivors ever since." The Riverside Children's Home fire of 1997 had been front-page news for exactly 3 days before bigger stories pushed it aside. A tragic accident, the investigators had concluded, faulty wiring in a building that housed 43 children, most of them wards of the state with nowhere else to go. The official report stated that 7 children had perished in the blaze, while 36 others had been rescued or evacuated safely. But Marcus Thompson knew something the investigators didn't. There had been 50 children in that building, not 43. 7 had died, 36 had been officially accounted for, and 7 others had simply vanished into the chaos of that terrible night. 7 children who had been deliberately erased from the records, their very existence scrubbed from every document, every file, every trace of bureaucratic evidence. Marcus knew this because he'd been there, not as a rescuer or a firefighter, or even as a concerned citizen. He'd been there as a young investigative journalist working for the New York Tribune, following a lead about corruption in the city's foster care system. What he'd discovered in those final moments before the fire consumed everything was a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of city government, and a cover-up that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The missing 7 weren't dead. They'd been taken, spirited away by people who had powerful reasons to ensure they never spoke about what they'd witnessed at Riverside. Children who had seen too much, knew too much, and represented a threat that certain very wealthy, very connected individuals couldn't afford to ignore. Marcus had tried to expose the truth. He'd written article after article, conducted interview after interview, but every lead dried up. Witnesses disappeared, documents vanished. His editor at the Tribune, a man he'd trusted like a father, suddenly reassigned him to cover local sports. And then came the threats, not against him, but against his younger sister Elena, his only family. Drop the story, or she disappears. 2. So Marcus Thompson, idealistic journalist, had made a choice that would define the rest of his life. He buried the story, left journalism forever, and channeled his rage into something else entirely, making enough money to buy the kind of power that could protect the people he cared about and find the children who had been stolen. It took him 15 years to build Thompson Industries from nothing into a Fortune 500 company. 15 years of ruthless deals, strategic acquisitions, and yes, some morally questionable decisions that he told himself were necessary means to a just end. He'd started with a small construction company, leveraged it into real estate development, then expanded into technology, defense contracts, and finally into the kind of diversified empire that gave him access to information networks most people couldn't even imagine. And for the past 12 years, he'd been using those networks to track down 7 children who were now adults, scattered across the country, most of them living on society's margins under assumed names or simply lost in the system's cracks. Marcus had found them one by one. Jessica Chen, now 29, living in Los Angeles under the name Maria Santos, working 3 jobs just to afford a studio apartment in the worst part of town. She'd aged out of foster care at 18, with no family, no support system, and no memory of her life before the fire. A convenient side effect of the trauma therapy she'd been subjected to in the months afterward. David Rodriguez, no relation. To the detective, 27, bouncing between shelters in Chicago, struggling with addiction and mental health issues that stemmed from nightmares he couldn't explain. He drew obsessively, dark, disturbing images of flames and shadowy figures that made social workers uncomfortable. Michael Park, 31, the oldest of the group, who'd somehow managed to build a small life for himself as a mechanic in Detroit. But Marcus's investigators had discovered that Michael never stayed in one place longer than 2 years, always moving, always looking over his shoulder as if he expected someone to find him. Then there were the twins, Amanda and Ashley Williams, 26 years old, who'd somehow managed to stay together through sheer determination and a bond that social workers described as unnaturally intense. They lived in a converted warehouse in Portland, surviving by taking odd jobs and trusting no one but each other. Sarah Johnson, 28, brilliant despite never having finished high school, who made money by hacking systems and selling information on the dark web. She lived completely off the grid in a rural cabin in Montana, surrounded by enough security equipment to outfit a small army. And finally, Tommy Chen, no relation to Jessica despite the shared surname, 25 years old, who'd spent the last 7 years in and out of prison for petty crimes. He was currently serving time in Sing Sing for Grand Theft Auto, scheduled for release in 3 weeks. 7 children who didn't know they were connected. 7 adults who had no idea that their struggles, their fears, their inability to settle down or trust people all stemmed from a single night of horror that had been systematically erased from their memories. Marcus had detailed files on each of them, not just their current situations, but their psychological profiles, their fears, their dreams, their patterns of behavior. He'd had them watched, not stalked, but monitored from a distance, protected without their knowledge. When Jessica's landlord tried to evict her illegally, an anonymous tip to a tenants' rights organization had materialized. When David overdosed in an alley behind a Chicago soup kitchen, the ambulance had arrived with suspicious speed. When someone broke into Sarah's Montana cabin, the intruders had found themselves facing a level of resistance that suggested their target had been warned in advance. For 12 years, Marcus had been their invisible guardian angel, keeping them alive while he planned for this moment. The moment when his own mortality would force him to finally roll the dice on the most important gamble of his life. The phone call to Detective Rodriguez had been the first step. The second had been placing 7 carefully orchestrated calls to social services offices across the country, each one reporting that a particular individual was in need of immediate assistance. Not arrests, not commitments, but interventions that would bring them all to New York under the pretense of emergency housing assistance. The third step had been the most audacious, formally adopting 7 adults through an obscure legal provision that allowed terminal individuals to establish guardianship for endangered persons. It had cost him $3 million in legal fees and donations to the right causes. But Marcus Thompson now had 7 adult children, the oldest of whom was only 13 years younger than him. The lawyers had been horrified. The social workers had been baffled. The media, when they inevitably caught wind of the story, would probably be brutal. Dying billionaire's final act of madness. Cancer patient adopts street people in bizarre publicity stunt. Let them laugh, Marcus thought as he reviewed the files one more time from his hospital bed. They didn't understand that this wasn't charity or madness or even guilt. This was justice, 30 years in the making. Because the people who had taken these children, who had tried to erase them from existence, were still out there, still powerful, still dangerous. And they were about to discover that Marcus Thompson had found their greatest secret and turned it into his final weapon. The 7 children of Riverside were coming home at last, and this time they were bringing an army with them. Outside his hospital window, the city sprawled endlessly in all directions, millions of lights twinkling in the darkness. Somewhere among those lights, his 7 new children were probably confused, scared, maybe even angry about this strange turn their lives had taken. They didn't know him, they didn't trust him, they certainly didn't love him, but they would understand eventually. When they learned the truth about who they really were and what had been stolen from them, they would understand that everything Marcus Thompson had built, his fortune, his empire, his carefully constructed life, had been built for them. The only question now was whether he would live long enough to see them reclaim what was rightfully theirs. Marcus closed his eyes and tried not to think about the pain medication that was becoming less effective each day, or the way Dr. Williams's expression had grown more concerned during their last consultation. There was still so much to do. So many pieces to put in place before his phone buzzed with a text message from his assistant. All 7 have been located and notified. First meeting scheduled for tomorrow at 2 p.m. as requested. Marcus smiled, the first genuine smile he'd felt in months. Tomorrow, the final chapter of this story would begin. And if the people who'd thought they'd buried the truth about Riverside were watching, they were about to learn that some secrets refuse to stay buried. Some debts can only be paid in full. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The limestone facade of Thompson Industries gleamed under the harsh afternoon sun as 7 very different people approached the building from 7 different directions. None of them knew the others were coming. None of them understood why they'd been summoned, and none of them had any idea that their lives were about to collide with the force of a freight train carrying 30 years of buried secrets. Jessica Chen, though she'd been living as Maria Santos for so long she almost believed. It herself stood across the street, staring up at the towering glass structure with a mixture of awe and suspicion. The letter in her purse had been specific. Report to Thompson Industries, 47th floor, conference room A, 2:01 p.m. sharp, regarding your recent adoption and immediate housing assistance. The whole thing felt like a scam, but 3 different social workers had confirmed its legitimacy, and frankly, Jessica was desperate enough to risk it. Her current landlord in Los Angeles had given her until Friday to come up with 2 months' back rent or face eviction. The cross-country bus ticket to New York had cost her last $100, money she'd scraped together by selling her laptop, the same laptop she used for her online data entry work. Now she had no home to return to, no job, and no idea what she was walking into. But something about the name Marcus Thompson nagged at her. She'd Googled him on a library computer before leaving LA, reading about his business empire, his philanthropic work, his reputation as a ruthless but fair negotiator. Nothing in his background suggested why he'd want to adopt 7 random adults, but Jessica had learned long ago that rich people did inexplicable things for inexplicable reasons. What she couldn't shake was the feeling that she'd heard his name before, somewhere in the hazy fog of her early memories. The doctors had told her that childhood trauma could cause selective amnesia, and she'd accepted that explanation for why everything before age 8 was basically a blank slate. But standing here, looking up at his building, something deep in her mind was stirring, and it didn't feel like gratitude. 2 blocks away, David Rodriguez sat in a McDonald's, nursing his 3rd cup of coffee and fighting the urge to bolt. He'd been clean for 6 weeks now, the longest stretch in 2 years, but the anxiety gnawing at his gut made him want to score just to make it stop. The voices of the other customers seemed too loud, the fluorescent lights too bright, the constant traffic noise outside like a symphony of chaos that made his hands shake. The notebook in his backpack was filled with drawings again. He'd started sketching obsessively the moment he'd gotten the letter about the adoption, and the images pouring out of his pencil were darker than usual. Burning buildings, shadowy figures in suits, children running through smoke, and always, a man with kind eyes and graying hair who seemed to be reaching for something just out of frame. David had shown the drawings to Dr. Martinez at the clinic where he got his methadone. "These look like recovered memories," she'd said carefully. "Sometimes when we're in transition, like with this adoption situation, our subconscious starts processing old traumas differently." But David couldn't remember any trauma involving fires or men in suits. According to his file, he'd been found wandering the streets of Chicago at age 8, malnourished and nonverbal. No family had ever been located. He'd spent the next decade bouncing between foster homes and group facilities, aging out at 18 with nothing but a garbage bag full of clothes and a head full of nightmares he couldn't explain. Now, at 27, he was being adopted by a billionaire he'd never heard of. It was either the best thing that had ever happened to him or an elaborate setup for something much worse. In David's experience, good things didn't just happen to people like him, but the letter had come with a first-class plane ticket from Chicago and a prepaid hotel room for 3 nights. Someone had invested real money in getting him here. David just hoped he'd live long enough to find out why. Meanwhile, Michael Park sat in the building's lobby, his mechanic's hands fidgeting with the zipper of his worn leather jacket. He'd driven his beat-up Camaro straight through from Detroit, stopping only for gas and coffee. The whole 17-hour trip haunted by a growing sense of dread he couldn't name. Michael was the oldest of the group at 31, and he'd developed survival instincts that had kept him alive through 2 decades of moving from city to city, never staying anywhere long enough to form real connections. He fixed cars, collected his pay in cash, and disappeared before anyone could get too curious. about his background or why he never talked about his family, but 3 weeks ago, everything had started going wrong. His current employer, Jimmy's Auto Repair in Detroit, had suddenly been visited by IRS agents asking questions about Michael's employment status. His landlord had mentioned that someone had been asking about him, a well-dressed woman with a badge and too many questions. And then, last Tuesday, Michael had spotted the same black sedan parked outside his apartment 3 nights in a row. That's when the letter arrived. Michael wasn't naive. He knew that billionaires didn't randomly adopt grown men who lived off the grid. This Marcus Thompson wanted something from him, and Michael had learned that when powerful people wanted something from you, it was usually something you couldn't afford to give. But running wasn't an option anymore. If Thompson had found him in Detroit, he could find him anywhere. Better to face whatever this was head-on than spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder. The elevator dinged, and Michael watched as 2 young women stepped out, identical twins with suspicious eyes and defensive postures that mirrored his own. They looked around the opulent lobby like they were casing it for exits, and Michael recognized the hypervigilance of people who'd learned not to trust gift horses. Amanda and Ashley Williams had indeed been scanning for exits, along with security cameras, potential weapons, and anything else that might be relevant if they needed to leave quickly. The twins had been taking care of each other for so long that they'd developed their own language of glances and subtle gestures, a communication system that let them coordinate without speaking. They'd hitchhiked from Portland with nothing but backpacks and a shared sense of foreboding. The adoption letter had found them at their warehouse squat, delivered by a courier who'd somehow located them despite their best efforts to stay invisible. That alone was cause for alarm. Amanda and Ashley had been ghosts for the better part of a decade, surviving on odd jobs and petty theft, never staying anywhere long enough to show up on anyone's radar. "I know," Amanda had whispered back, "but I also need to know why he has that picture." Now they stood in the elevator, riding up to the 47th floor, each twin acutely aware that they were walking into something that could either answer the questions that had haunted them their entire lives or destroy them completely. The elevator stopped, and they stepped out into a hallway that screamed expensive taste. Original artwork lined the walls, and the carpet was thick enough to muffle their footsteps. Conference Room A was at the end of the hall, its door flanked by 2 security guards who looked more like Secret Service agents than corporate security. Inside the room, they found 4 other people who looked as confused and wary as they felt. An Asian woman in her late 20s, nervously clutching a worn purse. A Hispanic man with artist's hands and the hollow eyes of someone fighting addiction. A white man in his 30s, whose posture suggested he was ready for a fight. And sitting, slightly apart from the others, a young black man who kept glancing at the door like he was calculating how quickly he could reach it. Tommy Chen had been released from Sing Sing exactly 18 hours ago, and he was still adjusting to being outside walls after 3 years of incarceration. The adoption papers had been waiting for him at the prison gates, along with a bus ticket to New York and instructions to report to this address. His parole officer had confirmed that this Marcus Thompson had somehow managed to sponsor Tommy's early release and had guaranteed housing and employment, a miracle that had shaved 2 years off his sentence. But Tommy had learned in prison that miracles usually came with prices attached. He'd spent the bus ride wondering what kind of job a billionaire might have for an ex-con with a record of grand theft auto and breaking and entering. Nothing legal, probably. Rich people didn't adopt street kids out of the goodness of their hearts. They did it because they needed someone disposable to do their dirty work. Still, anything was better than going back inside. Tommy had seen what happened to guys who violated parole, and he'd rather work for the devil himself than spend another day in a cell. The last to arrive was Sarah Johnson, and she entered the room like she owned it. While the others fidgeted, Nervously or scanned for threats, Sarah simply chose a chair with clear sightlines to all entrances and waited. She'd driven down from her Montana compound in a truck loaded with enough surveillance equipment to stock a spy movie, because if this was a trap, she intended to document every second of it. Sarah had been tracking Marcus Thompson's activities for weeks, ever since his name had first appeared in connection with her adoption papers. Her initial research had turned up the standard billionaire biography: rags to riches, ruthless business practices, extensive philanthropic work. But when she dug deeper, using methods that weren't entirely legal, she'd found something interesting. Thompson Industries had been quietly purchasing property around 7 specific addresses across the country for the past 5 years. Addresses where 7 specific people lived. Sarah's Montana cabin was surrounded by land that had been bought by Thompson shell companies and turned into a nature preserve, effectively creating a buffer zone around her home. The same pattern held for locations in LA, Chicago, Detroit, Portland, and 2 other cities. Someone had been watching all of them, protecting them maybe, but definitely watching. And now that someone wanted to meet face to face, Sarah had come armed with questions, and she intended to get answers. But first, she studied the 6 other people in the room, noting the subtle signs of shared trauma in their postures and expressions. Whatever connected them to Marcus Thompson, it was bigger than random charity. Much bigger. At exactly 2 p.m., the conference room door opened and a woman in an expensive suit entered, followed by 2 men in dark clothing who took positions by the door. The woman introduced herself as Victoria Blackwood, Thompson's chief legal counsel, and her expression was the kind of professionally neutral that suggested she was about to deliver news that nobody wanted to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "thank you for coming. I'm afraid Mr. Thompson is unable to join us today due to his ongoing medical treatment, but he's asked me to begin the process of explaining why you're here." She activated a wall-mounted screen, and suddenly the room was filled with the image of 7 children standing in front of a brick building. The same photograph Amanda and Ashley had been sent, but this version was crystal clear, showing 7 young faces with unmistakable clarity. This photograph was taken on October 15, 1997, exactly 3 days before the Riverside Children's Home fire that officially claimed 7 lives and left 36 children homeless. What the official reports didn't mention was that there were actually 50 children in that building, not 43. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. David's hands began to shake violently. Michael stood up so quickly his chair toppled backward. And all around the room, 6 other people began to remember things they'd been trained to forget. "You are the 7 children who were supposed to have died in that fire," Victoria continued, her voice cutting through the sudden chaos like a knife. "And Marcus Thompson has spent the last 30 years trying to find you and bring you home." The room erupted. Voices overlapped in a cacophony of denial, demands for proof, and questions that had no good answers. But beneath the noise, 7 minds began to process a truth that was both impossible and inevitable. They weren't strangers brought together by chance. They were survivors of something that had been deliberately hidden from them, something that powerful people had wanted to stay buried forever. And now, 30 years later, someone was finally ready to dig up the truth. Victoria Blackwood waited for the noise to die down, then smiled with the kind of cold satisfaction that suggested this was only the beginning. "Mr. Thompson will see you all tomorrow morning at 10. I suggest you spend tonight getting reacquainted with each other. You're going to need each other for what comes next." As the 7 survivors looked around the room at faces they now realized they'd known as children, one thought echoed in every mind: if they were supposed to be dead, Who had been trying to kill them? And more importantly, were they still trying? The penthouse suite at the Meridian Hotel had been transformed into a war room by midnight. 7 adults who'd been strangers 12 hours ago now sat around a coffee table covered with documents, photographs, and the remnants of room service meals that had gone cold hours before. The city sprawled below them through floor-to-ceiling windows, but none of them were paying attention to the view. They were too busy remembering. It had started with Jessica, or Maria, as she'd been calling herself for so long, that hearing her real name felt like putting on clothes that no longer fit. She'd been the first to speak after Victoria Blackwood's bombshell revelation, her voice barely above a whisper. "I dream about fire sometimes, always the same dream. I'm running down the hallway, and someone's calling my name, but when I turn around, there's just smoke." David had looked up from the sketch he'd been unconsciously drawing, a child's hand reaching through flames, and nodded slowly. "I draw that hallway. I've been drawing it for years, but I never knew why." That's when the floodgates had opened. Sarah had pulled out her laptop and started typing with the focused intensity of someone who solved problems for a living. "If we're really from this riverside place, there should be records. Birth certificates, intake forms, medical files. Give me an hour and I'll find whatever's left." But it was Michael who'd suggested they pool their resources and get a hotel suite where they could talk without worrying about who might be listening. If people tried to kill us once, they might try again. We need to assume we're being watched. Now, 6 hours later, the coffee table looked like the evidence board of a cold case investigation. Sarah's hacking skills had unearthed fragments of documents that had supposedly been destroyed in the fire. Amanda and Ashley had somehow managed to acquire building blueprints and city planning records through methods they declined to explain. Tommy had contributed a street-level understanding of how institutional cover-ups worked, knowledge gained from 3 years of watching how the system protected itself. But it was David's drawings that had provided the most unsettling breakthrough. "Look at this," he said, spreading out a series of sketches he'd made that evening. "I've been drawing the same faces for years, but I never realized they were real people." The drawings were crude but unmistakably accurate portraits of his 6 companions as children. Jessica with pigtails and a missing front tooth, Michael with a black eye and defiant expression, the twins holding hands, even as 7-year-olds inseparable, Sarah with thick glasses and a book clutched to her chest, Tommy grinning despite a split lip. "How is that possible?" Amanda asked, studying a drawing of herself and Ashley building something out of blocks. "I don't remember you. I don't remember any of this." "Memory suppression," Sarah said without looking up from her laptop. "I've been researching it. There are pharmaceutical methods, psychological conditioning, even experimental procedures that can selectively erase specific timeframes. It's not science fiction, it's just expensive and highly illegal." She turned her screen around to show them a medical journal article. Dr. Elena Vasquez, former head of pediatric psychiatry at Mount Sinai, published a paper in 1998 about treating severe trauma in children through guided memory reconstruction. The paper was retracted 6 months later, and Dr. Vasquez disappeared from academic medicine entirely. Disappeared how? Michael asked, his mechanic's mind automatically suspicious of convenient coincidences, like vanished. No forwarding address, no new employment, no trace of her after 1999. But here's the interesting part. She'd been consulting at Riverside, children's home, for 3 months before the fire, supposedly helping kids who'd witnessed violence in their previous placements. Tommy leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "So they brought in a specialist to mess with our heads, burned down the building to cover the evidence, then made us disappear into the system with no memory of what we'd seen." "But what did we see?" Jessica asked. "What could 7 kids have witnessed that was worth all this trouble?" The answer came from an unexpected source. Ashley, who'd been quietly examining a blueprint of the Riverside building, suddenly pointed to a section in the basement. There, that's where the bad room was. Everyone turned to stare at her. Ashley's face had gone pale, but her finger remained steady on the blueprint. I remember now. There was a room in the basement where the grown-ups had meetings. We weren't supposed to go down there, but sometimes we snuck down to listen, Amanda finished, her own memories suddenly clicking into place. There were important people. Men in expensive suits who came at night. David started sketching again, his hand moving automatically as the memories surfaced. They talked about money, lots of money, and kids who were being sent to special families. Not adoption, Sarah said, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she cross-referenced city records. Look at this. Riverside Children's Home received funding from something called the Heritage Foundation. On paper, it's a legitimate child welfare organization. But the Heritage Foundation was funded entirely by a single anonymous donor who contributed $12 million between 1995 and 1997. She pulled up another document. $12 million to run a facility that housed 50 kids. The math doesn't work unless they were doing something way more expensive than basic childcare. Michael stood and started pacing, his mind working through the logistics. They were running some kind of operation out of that basement, something that required keeping kids who'd seen too much and making sure they couldn't talk about it. Human trafficking, Tommy said bluntly. Has to be. Rich people wanting to buy kids, but not through legal channels. They needed a place that looked legitimate but could make children disappear when necessary. Jessica shook her head. But we weren't sold. We ended up in the regular foster system. Because the fire messed up their plans, Ashley said, her memory coming back in fragments. That night there were sirens everywhere. Police, firefighters, ambulances. They couldn't take us without being seen. So they did the next best thing, Amanda continued. They erased our memories and scattered us across the country, hoping we'd never find each other or remember what we'd witnessed. Sarah had gone very still, her eyes fixed on her laptop screen. Guys, you need to see this. I found a list of Heritage Foundation board members from 1997. She turned the screen around, and 7 pairs of eyes read the names in stunned silence. The list read like a who's who of American power. 2 federal judges, a senator, 3 Fortune 500 CEOs, and the commissioner of the New York Police Department. Jesus, Michael whispered. No wonder they could make evidence disappear. And no wonder they tried to kill us, David added, his latest sketch showing a group of children huddled in a basement listening at a door. Tommy leaned forward, his street instincts kicking in. These people are still alive, still powerful. If we start poking around, asking questions, they'll try to finish what they started 30 years ago, Sarah finished. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They weren't just survivors of a tragic fire. They were witnesses to a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government and business, and the people responsible had spent 3 decades believing their secret was safe. Jessica stood and walked to the window, looking out at the glittering city below. Marcus Thompson knew all this, she said quietly. That's why he adopted us. He's been planning this for 30 years. But why now? Amanda asked. Why wait so long? Because he's dying, Michael said with sudden clarity. He told us through his lawyer that he's in medical treatment. Guy that age, bringing together 7 people who are supposed to be dead. He's making his final play. Sarah was already pulling up everything she could find about Marcus Thompson's current condition. Pancreatic cancer, she announced after a few minutes of searching. Diagnosed 6 months ago. Prognosis is 6 to 8 months. So he's got maybe 2 months left, Ashley said. 2 months to expose a conspiracy that's been buried for 30 years, David added. Tommy stood up, his expression resolute. Then we better get started. These people think we're still the scared kids they tried to erase. Time to show them what we've become." But it was Sarah who voiced what they were all thinking. "There's something else. If Thompson has been watching us all these years, protecting us, keeping us alive, what happens when he dies? Who protects us then?" The question hung in the air like a death sentence. They'd found each other, started to remember the truth, and realized the scope of what they were up against. But they were still 7 people against a conspiracy that had roots in the most powerful institutions in America. And their only ally was a dying man who might not live to see them through. To the end, Michael walked over to the window where Jessica stood, the others gradually joining them in a loose circle. The city below pulsed with life, millions of people going about their ordinary lives, oblivious to the war that was about to begin in the shadows. "So what do we do?" Jessica asked. "We do what survivors do," Tommy said, his voice carrying the hard-earned wisdom of someone who'd learned to fight back. "We survive, and we make sure the people who tried to destroy us pay for what they did." Sarah closed her laptop with a decisive snap. "First, we meet with Thompson tomorrow and find out exactly what he knows and what he's been planning. Then we decide how far we're willing to go to get justice." "All the way," David said quietly, but with absolute certainty. "Whatever it takes." One by one, the others nodded their agreement. 7 children who'd been stolen from themselves were ready to reclaim their past and build their future, even if it meant taking on some of the most powerful people in America. But none of them noticed the black sedan parked across the street, or the telephoto lens pointed at their window, or the fact that their reunion was being documented by people who'd been watching and waiting for exactly this moment. The game was about to begin, and all the players were finally in position. But in a game where the stakes were life and death, there could be only one rule: winner takes all, and the losers would simply disappear, just like they were supposed to have done 30 years ago. The private wing of Mount Sinai Hospital felt more like a luxury hotel than a medical facility. Marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and the air smelled of fresh orchids rather than antiseptic. But despite the elegant surroundings, the 7 survivors of Riverside could feel the weight of mortality pressing down on them as they followed Victoria Blackwood through hushed corridors toward Marcus Thompson's private suite. It was 10 a.m. sharp when they entered the spacious room where their mysterious benefactor awaited them. Marcus Thompson sat propped up in a hospital bed that had been positioned to face a wall of windows overlooking Central Park. Even diminished by illness, he commanded attention. Silver hair perfectly styled, sharp blue eyes that missed nothing, and an aura of controlled power that 30 years of building an empire had etched into his very bones. But it was the wall behind him that made 7 hearts collectively stop beating. Every inch of available space was covered with photographs, documents, newspaper clippings, and what could only be described as the most comprehensive investigation board any of them had ever seen. Pictures of them as children at Riverside, surveillance photos of their adult lives, financial records, legal documents, and in the center of it all, a detailed organizational chart showing the Heritage Foundation's connections to dozens of powerful figures across government, business, and law enforcement. "Please sit down," Marcus said, his voice carrying the raspy quality of someone whose body was betraying him, but whose mind remained razor-sharp. "I apologize for the dramatic presentation, but time is not on our side, and there's far too much you need to know." The 7 took seats in chairs that had been arranged in a semicircle facing the bed. Victoria Blackwood positioned herself near the door, tablet in hand, ready to document everything that was about to unfold. Marcus studied each face carefully before speaking again. 30 years ago, I was a young journalist who thought I could change the world by exposing corruption. I was arrogant, naive, and completely unprepared for what I discovered at Riverside Children's Home. He pressed a button on the bed's control panel, and a large monitor descended from the ceiling, displaying a photograph of Marcus as a young man, maybe 25, with the eager expression of someone who believed truth and justice were more than just abstract concepts. I'd been investigating irregularities in the city's foster care system when I received an anonymous tip about Riverside. Someone claimed children were being sold to wealthy buyers, but not through normal adoption channels. Black market transactions with prices that ran into the hundreds of thousands of dollars per child. Sarah leaned forward, her analytical mind already processing the implications. "You went undercover." I tried to. Posed as a potential buyer, claimed I represented a wealthy client who preferred discreet arrangements. What I found was far worse than simple human trafficking. The monitor switched to show a floor plan of Riverside's basement level, far more complex than the blueprints they'd found the night before. Hidden rooms, underground tunnels, and what appeared to be a sophisticated medical facility. The Heritage Foundation wasn't just selling children, Marcus continued, his voice growing harder. They were running experiments. Psychological conditioning, memory manipulation, even genetic research. They were trying to create the perfect victim. Children who could be programmed, who would have no memory of their past, who could be molded into whatever their buyers desired. Michael's hands clenched into fists. "We were lab rats." "You were the test subjects for something much more ambitious," Marcus corrected. "The 7 of you weren't random selections. You were specifically chosen because you all showed certain psychological markers, high intelligence, strong survival instincts, and most importantly, resistance to standard conditioning techniques." Amanda and Ashley exchanged one of their wordless communications before Amanda spoke. "That's why they couldn't break us completely. Why we kept some of our memories even after the treatments." Exactly. Dr. Elena Vasquez's memory suppression. Techniques worked partially, but your minds fought back. You retained fragments, impressions, dreams. You were the failures that proved the system wasn't perfect. Tommy shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "So they decided to kill us to cover their tracks." "The fire wasn't meant to kill you," Marcus said, and the room went very still. "It was meant to destroy the evidence. You were supposed to be evacuated with the other children and then disappear into a different program, one run by Dr. Vasquez, in a facility upstate where they could perfect their techniques." The monitor displayed a series of transport documents dated October 18, 1997, the night of the fire. 7 children listed for transfer to Clearwater Residential Treatment Center in the Adirondack Mountains. But something went wrong. Jessica said, the pieces clicking together in her mind. Marcus smiled grimly. Someone tipped off the fire department about the basement operations. The building was swarming with first responders before the Heritage Foundation could execute their extraction plan. In the chaos, U7 were processed through normal emergency protocols and sent to regular foster placements instead of Clearwater. David looked up from the sketch he'd been unconsciously making, a building surrounded by police cars and fire trucks. "Who called it in?" "I did." Marcus's admission hung in the air like a confession. "I'd been documenting everything for weeks, gathering evidence for what I thought would be the story of my career. When I realized what was about to happen to you children, I called 911 and reported a fire in progress." "You saved us," Sarah said. "Quietly, I tried to, but I was young and stupid, and I underestimated how far these people would go to protect themselves. Within hours of the fire, I was contacted by people who made it very clear that my investigation would end immediately, or my sister Elena would pay the price." The monitor showed a photograph of a young woman with Marcus's eyes and a warm smile. Elena was a social worker in Boston, completely innocent of everything that was happening in New York. But they had people watching her, following her, documenting her routines. They could have made her disappear any time they wanted. "So you buried the story," Michael said, understanding the impossible choice Marcus had faced. "I buried the story, left journalism, and spent the next 15 years building enough wealth and power to protect the people I cared about. But I never stopped looking for you, Seven. I knew that if you were alive, you'd eventually remember fragments of what happened, and I knew that when you did, you'd be in danger." Victoria Blackwood stepped forward, consulting her tablet. "Mr. Thompson has been monitoring all of you for 12 years. Financial assistance when you needed it, security interventions when you were threatened, legal protection when you encountered problems with law enforcement. None of you realized it, but you've been under his protection this entire time." Tommy laughed bitterly. "Protection? I spent 3 years in prison, where you were kept in minimum security, protected from the gang violence that kills most inmates with your record, and released 2 years early through an intervention you were told." "Was routine," Victoria replied smoothly. "Mr. Thompson's influence reaches into many institutions. The point is," Marcus continued, "I've spent 30 years preparing for this moment, building resources, gathering evidence, positioning assets. Everything I've done has been leading to this, bringing you together and giving you the tools to finish what I started." The monitor displayed a new image, a complex organizational chart showing Thompson Industries' various subsidiaries and holdings, defense contractors, technology companies, media outlets, and dozens of other businesses spread across the country. "Thompson Industries isn't just a business empire," Marcus explained. "It's a weapon designed to fight the Heritage Foundation and everyone connected to it. Every acquisition, every strategic partnership, every seemingly random business decision has been calculated to give us leverage over the people who tried to destroy you." Sarah's eyes widened as she studied the chart. "You've been systematically infiltrating their power structure. For 30 years, I own companies that provide security, services to 3 Heritage Foundation board members. I have financial interests in the pension funds of half the judges in New York. I employ the children and grandchildren of politicians who were involved in the cover-up." Amanda looked skeptical. "And they never figured out what you were doing?" "They thought I was just another ruthless businessman building an empire. The beauty of capitalism is that greed provides perfect camouflage for revenge." Marcus's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "But now, the end game begins, and I need you, Seven, to execute it." He pressed another button, and the monitor showed a detailed timeline stretching from 1997 to the present day. "In 2 weeks, the Heritage Foundation is holding its 30th anniversary gala at the Waldorf Astoria. Every surviving board member will be there, along with their current operations leadership and the next generation of wealthy buyers." "You want us to crash their party?" David asked. "I want you to destroy them completely, not just expose their past crimes, but dismantle their current operations and ensure they can never hurt another child." Victoria moved to stand beside the bed, her expression all business. "Mr. Thompson has spent 3 decades gathering evidence of ongoing criminal activity. The Heritage Foundation never stopped operating, they just became more careful. They're still trafficking children, still running experimental programs, still serving wealthy clients who pay premium prices for victims who can't remember their past." The monitor displayed surveillance footage from various locations. Children being moved in unmarked vans, meetings in expensive restaurants, financial transactions that defied explanation. "We have the evidence to destroy them legally," Marcus said. "But evidence means nothing if the people responsible can make it disappear or discredit the witnesses. That's where you come in. He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze intense despite his physical weakness. "You're not just survivors. You're living proof of their crimes. You're the witnesses they thought they'd silence forever. And you're the only people who can't be bought, threatened, or discredited because you've already lost everything they could take from you." Tommy leaned back in his chair, his street-smart mind working through the angles. "What exactly are you asking us to do?" "I'm asking you to infiltrate the Heritage Foundation's gala, gather real-time evidence of their current operations, and help me broadcast their crimes to the world in a way that makes cover-up impossible. And if they try to stop us?" Jessica asked. Marcus's expression grew cold. "Then you use every skill you've learned in 30 years of survival to make sure they don't succeed. These people tried to steal your minds, your memories, your very identities. They scattered you across the country and hoped you'd die forgotten and alone." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But you didn't die. You survived, you grew strong, and you found each other. Now it's time to remind them that some things can't be buried, no matter how deep they dig the grave." The room fell silent as 7 minds processed what they were being asked to do. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice for every child who'd suffered, every family that had been destroyed, every life that had been stolen by people who thought their wealth and power made them untouchable. Finally, Sarah spoke. "For all of them, what do you need us to do?" Marcus Thompson smiled, and for a moment he looked like the idealistic young journalist who'd once believed he could change the world. "I need you to help me finish the story I started 30 years ago, and this time we're going to make sure it has the right ending." The war for their past and their future was about to begin. The Thompson Industries training facility in the Catskill Mountains looked like a corporate retreat center from the outside. Modern buildings nestled among pine trees, with scenic walking paths and what appeared to be conference rooms designed for executive team-building exercises. But the 7 survivors of Riverside learned within hours that appearances could be devastatingly deceiving. "Welcome to your crash course in corporate espionage," announced Jackson Pierce, a man in his 40s whose casual demeanor couldn't quite hide the military precision in his movements. "Mr. Thompson has given us 10 days to turn you from survivors into operators. It's not enough time, but it's what we have." They stood in what looked like a hotel lobby, complete with marble floors and comfortable seating areas. But Sarah's trained eye had already spotted the subtle security measures. Cameras hidden in decorative molding, reinforced glass that could stop bullets, and exit routes that led to what were clearly defensive positions rather than parking lots. "Who exactly are you?" Michael asked, his mechanic's instincts telling him that Pierce's casual clothes were concealing more than just muscle. Former CIA, former private military contractor, current head of Thompson Industries Security Division, Pierce replied without hesitation. "Mr. Thompson recruited me 8 years ago, specifically to prepare for this operation. Everything we're about to teach you has been designed with one goal in mind: getting you into that gala alive, and getting you out with evidence that will destroy the Heritage Foundation." He gestured toward a corridor lined with doors. "Each of you will be training in different specialties based on your natural abilities and the roles you'll play at the gala. But first, let me introduce you to the person who's going to keep you alive." A woman emerged from an elevator, Asian, maybe 35, with the kind of controlled grace that suggested she could kill someone with her bare hands while maintaining perfect posture. She wore a simple black suit, but her eyes held the calculating coldness of a predator. "This is Dr. Stephanie Kim," Pierce continued, "former North Korean intelligence, former Mossad consultant, current miracle worker who specializes in rapid psychological preparation for high-stress infiltration missions." Dr. Kim studied each of them with the clinical intensity of a scientist examining specimens. You have 10 days to overcome 30 years of survival conditioning that taught you to hide, run, and avoid confrontation. I'm going to teach you to do the opposite, to walk into the most dangerous situation of your lives and perform like you belong there. She looked directly at Jessica. You've spent 15 years making yourself invisible. I'm going to teach you to command attention and use it as a weapon. Then to David, your art has been an escape from reality. I'm going to show you how to use it to manipulate perception and create the illusions we need. Her gaze moved to Michael. You fix things by taking them apart and rebuilding them. We're going to apply that mindset to people and social situations. To the twins, you've survived by being two people who think as one. I'm going to teach you to be mirrors that show people what they want to see. To Sarah, you've hidden behind technology and isolation. I'm going to force you to become the kind of person who can hack human psychology as easily as computer systems. And finally to Tommy, you've learned to read people to avoid danger. I'm going to teach you to read them to create opportunity. The next 10 days would transform them in ways none of them could have imagined. Jessica's training took place in what Pierce called the social engineering suite, a series of rooms that could be reconfigured to simulate any high-end social environment. Her instructor was a woman named Catherine Walsh, a former con artist who'd been recruited by Thompson Industries after serving 5 years for running elaborate financial scams against wealthy marks. The key to infiltrating elite society, Catherine explained as Jessica practiced walking in heels that cost more than she used to make in a month, is understanding that rich people are just as insecure as everyone else. They just have better ways of hiding it. Jessica stumbled slightly, cursing under her breath. She'd spent so many years dressed in thrift store clothes and generic sneakers that wearing a designer gown felt like putting on a costume for a play she'd never auditioned for. Stop thinking about the clothes, Catherine said sharply. Think about the character. You're not Jessica Chen, former data entry clerk from Los Angeles. You're Victoria Sinclair, art gallery owner from San Francisco, and you're at this gala because you're considering a major donation to children's charities. But I don't know anything about art galleries. You don't need to know about art galleries. You need to know about people who own art galleries. They're obsessed with status. They speak in code to exclude outsiders, and they're always looking for the next opportunity to network with someone more powerful than they are. Catherine handed Jessica a champagne flute filled with sparkling water. Practice. You're at a cocktail party, and the man approaching you just mentioned he's on the board of the Metropolitan Museum. What do you say? Jessica took a deep breath and channeled every movie she'd ever seen about rich people. How fascinating. I've been thinking about expanding my collection into contemporary pieces. Do you think the Met would be interested in hosting a private viewing for potential donors? Catherine smiled. Better. Now you're thinking like someone who belongs in that room. Meanwhile, David was learning that his artistic abilities could be weaponized in ways he'd never considered. His instructor, a man named Robert Chen, who claimed to be a former forger for intelligence agencies, had transformed one of the training rooms into an art studio, equipped with everything from traditional painting supplies to high-tech digital equipment. Your sketches have been documenting suppressed memories for years, Robert explained, as David worked on a portrait that would become part of his cover identity. But art can also create false memories, manipulate emotions, and plant suggestions in people's subconscious minds. David was painting a landscape that looked peaceful at first glance, but contained subtle details that would trigger specific psychological responses in viewers. A shadow that suggested a watching figure, colors that promoted anxiety, compositional elements that drew the eye to particular focal points. The Heritage Foundation's gala will be full of art collectors and patrons, Robert continued. Your cover identity is as an emerging artist whose work deals with childhood trauma. People will expect you to be slightly unstable, emotionally intense, and obsessed with your subject matter. In other words, you can act exactly like yourself while gathering intelligence. And if someone recognizes me from Riverside? Robert's expression grew serious. Then you use your art to convince them they're remembering wrong. Gaslighting through visual manipulation is one of the most powerful tools in an artist's arsenal. Michael's training was taking place in what looked like a luxury hotel suite. But every piece of furniture, every electronic device, and every decorative element had been designed to teach him about the hidden infrastructure that kept wealthy people's lives running smoothly. His instructor was a woman named Elena Rodriguez, a former cat burglar who'd spent 20 years infiltrating high-security locations before Thompson Industries offered her a more legitimate outlet for her skills. Rich people depend on technology they don't understand, Elena explained, as Michael examined a champagne glass that contained a microscopic recording device. They surround themselves with security systems, communication networks, and monitoring equipment, but they rarely know how any of it actually works. Michael turned the glass over in his hands, admiring the craftsmanship that had hidden advanced electronics inside what appeared to be standard crystal. So I'm going to be their friendly neighborhood tech support? You're going to be the catering company's IT consultant, called in at the last minute to troubleshoot problems with the gala's audio-visual systems. It gives you access to every room in the building, permission to examine any electronic device, and the invisibility that comes with being service staff. Elena showed him a toolbox that looked ordinary, but contained equipment worth more than most people's cars. Surveillance devices, signal interceptors, network penetration tools, and a few items that can disable security systems without triggering alarms. You'll have 30 minutes during the gala to plant monitoring equipment throughout the Waldorf Astoria. And if I get caught, then you use your most powerful weapon, the fact that people like you fix their cars, their computers, and their problems for years without them ever really seeing you. To them, you're furniture with a useful function. The twins were training together, as they did everything else, but their instructors had designed a program that would let them operate as independent agents while maintaining their psychic connection. Amanda worked with a former diplomat named Harrison Webb, learning the subtle art of reading micro-expressions and body language. You'll be posing as a freelance journalist, covering the charity circuit, Webb explained, as Amanda practiced asking seemingly innocent questions that would reveal crucial information. People love talking to reporters who make them feel important. Ashley trained with a woman named Lisa Park, a former casino security expert who specialized in reading tells and manipulating social dynamics. You're Amanda's photographer, Lisa said, as Ashley learned to use professional camera equipment that had been modified to capture more than just images. Which means you can go anywhere, point recording devices at anyone, and people will actually pose for you. The beautiful thing about your twin connection, Webb added during one of their joint sessions, is that you can coordinate intelligence gathering without any technological communication. Amanda can ask questions on one side of the room while Ashley documents reactions on the other side, and you'll both know instantly what the other person is learning. Sarah's training was perhaps the most intensive because her role required her to overcome a lifetime of social isolation. Her instructor was a man named David Kim, a former NSA analyst who'd spent 15 years developing psychological profiles of foreign intelligence operatives. You're going to be the most dangerous person in that room, Kim explained, as Sarah practiced making small talk with strangers. But only if you can get close enough to your targets to deploy your real weapons. Those weapons included modified smartphone that could clone any wireless device within 50 feet, earrings that could record conversations from across a crowded room, and a bracelet that could inject malware into any computer system she touched. Your cover identity is as a A tech entrepreneur who's developed apps for managing charitable donations, Kim continued. It gives you legitimate reasons to be interested in the Heritage Foundation's financial operations, and it explains why you're carrying so much electronic equipment. But I'm terrible with people. No, you're selective with people. There's a difference. You've spent years learning to read digital systems and anticipate their behaviors. People are just biological systems running social software. Once you understand their programming, they're as easy to manipulate as any computer. Tommy's training was the most psychological intensive because his role required him to become someone completely different from the street-smart ex-con he'd been for most of his adult life. His instructor was a woman named Dr. Patricia Williams, not the doctor who treated Marcus Thompson, but a former FBI behavioral analyst who specialized in creating deep cover identities for undercover operatives. You're going to be the son of one of the Heritage Foundation's board members, Dr. Williams explained, as Tommy practiced speaking with the refined accent of someone who'd attended elite private schools. Someone who's been away at European universities for the past few years and is now returning to take his place in the family business. They'll know I'm not really someone's son. Actually, they won't, because you are someone's son, just not who they think. According to the identity we've created, you're the illegitimate child of Judge Harrison Blackwell, one of the Heritage Foundation's founding members. Blackwell has been paying to keep you quiet and educated abroad, but now you're ready to claim your inheritance. Tommy studied the psychological profile they'd created for his cover identity. Judge Blackwell is dead. Died 6 months ago, which is why you're finally free to return to America and reveal your parentage. His family is still processing his estate, which gives you a window to claim your place at the table before anyone can verify your story. Dr. Williams handed him a leather portfolio filled with forged documents, birth certificates, school records, financial statements, even family photographs that had been digitally manipulated to include Tommy's face. The beauty of infiltrating wealthy families is that they're full of secrets, shame, and things they don't want to discuss publicly. No one will ask too many questions about the illegitimate son who suddenly appears, because admitting you exist means admitting their patriarch wasn't the moral paragon they've been claiming he was. By the end of 10 days, 7 people who'd arrived at the facility as confused survivors had transformed into something much more dangerous, a coordinated team of operatives with complementary skills and a shared mission. They'd learned to walk, talk, dress, and think like the kind of people who belonged at exclusive galas. They'd mastered the technology that would let them gather evidence while maintaining their covers. Most importantly, they'd learned to trust each other completely because their lives would depend on perfect coordination once they entered the Waldorf Astoria. On their final night at the facility, they gathered in the main conference room for a final briefing from Jackson Pierce and Dr. Kim. Tomorrow night, you'll be walking into a room full of people who've spent 30 years believing you were dead, Pierce began. Some of them will recognize you immediately. Others might notice resemblances, but dismiss them as coincidence. A few might realize exactly who you are and what your presence means. Dr. Kim continued the thought. Your psychological preparation has focused on maintaining your covers under pressure. But remember, you're not just pretending to be other people. You're reclaiming the identities that were stolen from you as children. You belong in that room more than anyone else because you're the living proof of their crimes. And if everything goes wrong? Michael asked. Pierce smiled grimly. Then you use everything we've taught you to make sure they're secrets. Die with them. This is a war, and wars have casualties. Just make sure you're not among them. As they prepared for what could be their final night alive, 7 survivors of Riverside Children's Home had become something their enemies never expected. Weapons forged in the fires of their own trauma pointed directly at the hearts of the people who'd tried to destroy them. The Heritage Foundation's 30th anniversary gala would be a celebration of their power and success. It was also going to be their funeral. The Waldorf Astoria's grand ballroom had been transformed into a monument to American power and influence. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over tables adorned with arrangements of white orchids that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Men in $1,000 tuxedos moved through the crowd with the casual confidence of people who'd never questioned their right to rule, while women draped in designer gowns and jewels worth small fortunes laughed at jokes that weren't funny but came from the right lips. To anyone watching from the outside, the Heritage Foundation's 30th anniversary gala looked like every other high society charity event that graced the pages of Manhattan's social magazines. But 7 people scattered throughout the ballroom knew better. They could see the subtle security measures, the careful positioning of exits, and most tellingly, the way certain conversations stopped abruptly when servers passed too close. This wasn't just a celebration, it was a business meeting for people whose business was unspeakable. Jessica, now Victoria Sinclair, art gallery owner from San Francisco, stood near the silent auction display, nursing a glass of champagne and studying the room's dynamics with the predatory focus Catherine Walsh had drilled into her. The transformation was remarkable. The woman who'd spent 15 years making herself invisible now commanded attention simply by existing in expensive clothing and carrying herself like she belonged among titans of industry. The Monet is exquisite, don't you think? The voice belonged to a silver-haired man in his 60s whose face Jessica recognized from Marcus Thompson's files. Senator William Hartwell, Heritage Foundation board member and chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Breathtaking, Jessica replied, allowing just enough uncertainty to creep into her voice. Though I have to admit, I'm more interested in the Foundation's work than the artwork. I've been considering a substantial donation to children's charities, but I want to ensure my money goes to organizations that truly understand the complexities of child welfare. Senator Hartwell's eyes sharpened with the interest of a shark detecting blood in the water. How substantial. 8 figures, Jessica said casually, watching his face carefully, but only for organizations that can demonstrate real impact. I've heard fascinating things about the Heritage Foundation's residential programs. Perhaps we should discuss this privately, Hartwell said, his voice dropping to the confidential tone reserved for negotiations that couldn't happen in public. There are aspects of our work that require discretion. Jessica felt her heart rate spike, but her training kicked in. Of course, I understand that the most effective charitable work often operates away from public scrutiny. As Hartwell led her toward a quiet corner, Jessica subtly activated the recording device hidden in her vintage bracelet. Phase 1 was in motion. Across the ballroom, David, now Daniel Morrison, emerging artist and trauma specialist, stood before an easel displaying one of his works. The painting showed children at play, but hidden within the innocent scene were subtly disturbing elements that made viewers unconsciously uncomfortable. It was psychological warfare disguised as art therapy. Powerful piece, commented a woman whose face David recognized from newspaper photographs. Dr. Margaret Westfield, former head of pediatric psychiatry at 3 major hospitals and current director of the Heritage Foundation's research initiatives. Thank you, David replied, letting his voice carry the slight tremor of an artist discussing his deepest work. It's part of a series exploring recovered childhood memories. Fascinating how the mind can bury traumatic experiences so completely that they only resurface through artistic expression. Dr. Westfield stepped closer to the painting, her clinical interest evident. And what specific traumas inspire your work? David's training had prepared him for this moment. Institutional abuse, primarily. children who were subjected to experimental psychological treatments in facilities that claimed to be helping them. The mind's capacity for memory suppression is remarkable, but the subconscious always finds ways to process the truth. You speak as if you have personal experience with such treatments. Don't we all carry childhood traumas that shape our art? David deflected, but he could see the recognition beginning to dawn in Dr. Westfield's eyes. She was starting to remember a 7-year-old boy who'd fought against her memory suppression techniques 30 years ago. Meanwhile, Michael had successfully infiltrated the Waldorf's technical infrastructure. Wearing the coveralls and badge of Morrison Audio Visual Services, he moved through the ballroom's service areas with the invisibility that came from being perceived as working-class labor in a room full of elites. The evening's entertainment required a complex audiovisual setup, and Michael's fictional last-minute call to troubleshoot technical difficulties had given him access to every electronic system in the building. As he worked, installing microscopic surveillance devices and network penetration tools, he listened to the fragments of conversation that filtered through air vents and thin walls. Shipment from Southeast Asia arrives next month. The facility in Montana is ready for the next batch. Congressional oversight is becoming problematic, but we have solutions. Each overheard phrase added another piece to the puzzle of the Heritage Foundation's current operations. They weren't just celebrating past successes, they were planning future crimes. Michael finished installing a particularly sophisticated listening device in the private dining room, where the Foundation's inner circle would retreat for their most sensitive discussions. According to the evening schedule, that meeting would begin in exactly 47 minutes. The twins were operating as the perfect two-person intelligence team. Amanda, posing as freelance journalist Rebecca Walsh, worked the crowd with the aggressive friendliness of someone hunting for exclusive stories. Her press credentials, forged but registered in multiple legitimate databases, gave her permission to ask probing questions that would seem suspicious from anyone else. "Such an impressive gathering," she said to Judge Patricia Kane, another Heritage Foundation board member. "I'm working on a piece about the evolution of child welfare policies over the past 30 years. I understand the Heritage Foundation has been at the forefront of innovative approaches to treating traumatized children." Judge Kane's smile was perfectly calibrated for public consumption. "We've always believed in comprehensive treatment approaches that address the root causes of childhood trauma." "Fascinating. I'd love to learn more about your residential treatment programs. Are those still operational?" "Some of our methodologies have evolved beyond traditional residential care," Kane replied carefully. "Modern approaches to memory therapy have made certain historical programs obsolete." Ashley, photographing the exchange from across the room, with equipment that captured far more than visible light, caught the micro-expressions that revealed Kane's discomfort with the line of questioning. Her modified camera was simultaneously recording conversations, mapping facial recognition patterns, and transmitting real-time intelligence to Sarah's monitoring station. Sarah had positioned herself in the ballroom's mezzanine level, where the Foundation's technology sponsors were demonstrating their latest innovations in child monitoring and behavioral modification. Her cover as tech entrepreneur Rachel Kim gave her legitimate reasons to examine every device, ask detailed questions about capabilities, and most importantly, to connect her modified smartphone to their demonstration networks. "The biometric tracking capabilities are impressive," she said to Dr. James Chen, the Foundation's current technology director. "How extensive is the monitoring in your residential facilities?" "Comprehensive," Dr. Chen replied with obvious pride. "We can track every vital sign, sleep pattern, emotional state, and behavioral indicator in real time. Complete psychological profiling updated continuously." And the children don't object to such intensive monitoring. Dr. Chen's laugh sent chills down Sarah's spine. By the time they reach our advanced programs, subject compliance is rarely an issue. Our memory modification protocols ensure complete cooperation. Sarah's training had prepared her for this moment, but hearing casual discussion of mind control techniques being used on children still made her want to vomit. Instead, she smiled and asked follow-up questions while her hidden devices copied every file on Dr. Chen's demonstration tablet. Tommy had perhaps the most dangerous assignment of the evening. As the supposed illegitimate son of deceased board member Judge Harrison Blackwell, he was expected to mingle with the Foundation's leadership and prove his worthiness to inherit his father's position. "You have Harrison's eyes," observed Mrs. Eleanor Blackwell, the judge's widow, studying Tommy with the calculating gaze of someone protecting family assets. "Though I must say, your sudden appearance has raised certain questions." "I understand completely," Tommy replied, channeling every acting lesson Dr. Williams had given him. "Father was ashamed of the circumstances of my birth, but he did provide for my education and upbringing. I have no interest in disrupting the family's public image. I simply want to honor his legacy by continuing his work with the Foundation." Mrs. Blackwell's expression remained skeptical. "And what do you know about Harrison's work with the Foundation?" Tommy had memorized Judge Blackwell's entire file, including details about cases he'd influenced, legislation he'd shaped, and most importantly, the specific role he'd played in covering up Heritage Foundation activities. "I know that he believed some forms of justice operate outside public courtrooms," Tommy said carefully. "That protecting society sometimes requires making difficult decisions about individuals who pose ongoing threats." "Threats? Children who've witnessed things they shouldn't have seen, adults who might remember experiences they're supposed to have forgotten. Father understood that some people need to be managed for the greater good." Mrs. Blackwell's hostility began to soften into approval. "Perhaps you do understand the family business after all." As the evening progressed, the 7 infiltrators gathered intelligence that painted a horrifying picture of the Heritage Foundation's current operations. They weren't just continuing their historical crimes, they were expanding them. The organization now operated facilities in 12 states, had partnerships with technology companies developing advanced surveillance and behavior modification systems, and maintained networks of judges, politicians, and business leaders who protected their activities from investigation. But the most disturbing revelation came when the Foundation's inner circle retreated to their private dining room for what they called the annual review. Michael's surveillance devices captured every word of a conversation that would have destroyed them all if recorded by law enforcement. "The Montana facility is ready for the next acquisition phase," reported Dr. Westfield. "We've identified 43 candidates from foster care systems across the western states. All show the psychological markers we've learned to target." "Excellent," replied Senator Hartwell. "And the buyers? Waiting list is substantial. The European clients are particularly interested in the advanced conditioning protocols. They're willing to pay premium prices for subjects who've undergone complete memory reconstruction." Judge Kane leaned forward. "What about security concerns? The recent adoption of those street people by that dying billionaire, Thompson, wasn't it? Has some of our older members concerned?" "Thompson is terminally ill and will be dead within weeks," Dr. Westfield assured her. "As for those 7 adults, our surveillance indicates they're simply desperate people grateful for housing. Assistance. None show signs of recovered memories or pose any threat to operations." The irony was almost too perfect. Even as 7 survivors of their crimes moved through the ballroom gathering evidence that would destroy them, the Heritage Foundation's leadership remained convinced they were untouchable. But the most chilling moment came when Dr. Chen mentioned their generational continuity project. "We've been developing techniques for ensuring institutional knowledge transfer," he explained. "Comprehensive files on every child we've processed, every family we've infiltrated, every official we've compromised. The goal is to create a self-perpetuating system that can operate independently of any single generation of leadership. In other words," Senator Hartwell clarified, "even if our current leadership were somehow exposed or eliminated, the organization would continue operating under the next generation." "Precisely. We've learned from historical mistakes. No single point of failure this time." As the private meeting continued, revealing details about offshore banking operations, international trafficking networks, and plans for expanding into new markets, the 7 infiltrators realized they weren't just fighting for justice for their own suffering. They were fighting to prevent countless future victims from enduring the same horrors, but they were also learning that their enemies were more powerful, more organized, and more dangerous than even Marcus Thompson had realized. The Heritage Foundation wasn't just a criminal organization, it was a hydra that had grown new heads every time someone tried to cut it down. The evening was approaching its climax, and soon they would have to make their move. They had gathered enough evidence to expose the Foundation's current operations, but actually, broadcasting that evidence to the world would require getting past security measures that included not just cameras and guards, but also people who wouldn't hesitate to kill to protect their secrets. As midnight approached, 7 survivors of Riverside Children's Home prepared to risk everything on one final gamble. They had walked into the lion's den, gathered the intelligence they needed, and now they had to find a way to escape alive while ensuring their enemies could never hurt another child. The most dangerous part of their mission was about to begin. And failure would mean not just their own deaths, but the perpetuation of a system of horror that had already destroyed too many innocent lives. The final act was about to commence, and there would be no second chances. At 11:47 p.m., everything went wrong. Dr. Margaret Westfield had been studying David's painting for nearly 20 minutes. Her clinical mind working through fragments of memory that had been buried for 3 decades. Something about the young artist's face, the way he held his hands, the particular intensity in his eyes when he spoke about childhood trauma. It all felt hauntingly familiar. Then she saw it. A small scar on David's left temple, barely visible, under his carefully styled hair. She remembered that scar. She remembered the 7-year-old boy who'd gotten it when he'd fought against the restraints during one of her memory suppression sessions at Riverside. "Danny Rodriguez," she whispered, using the name from his original file. "You were supposed to be dead." David felt the blood drain from his face, but his training kicked in. "I'm sorry. I think you have me confused with someone else. My name is Daniel Morrison." But Dr. Westfield was already reaching for her phone, her fingers moving toward what David recognized as a panic button that would alert Heritage Foundation security. In that split second, he had to make a choice that would determine whether their entire mission succeeded or failed catastrophically. David grabbed Dr. Westfield's wrist, stopping her from pressing the button. "Listen to me very carefully," he said, his voice carrying a deadly calm that surprised even him. "You have 30 seconds to decide whether you want to live through the next hour." Across the ballroom, Amanda noticed the sudden change in David's body language and immediately signaled Ashley with a barely perceptible gesture. The twins had developed their own crisis communication system during their years on the streets, and within seconds, Ashley was positioning herself to provide visual coverage, while Amanda moved to create a distraction. "Ladies and gentlemen," Amanda announced, raising her voice just enough to draw attention without seeming panicked. "I'm Rebecca Walsh from Metropolitan Arts Quarterly, and I'm hoping to capture some candid reactions to Mr. Morrison's powerful exhibition. Could I get a few of our distinguished guests to share their thoughts on how art can help us process historical traumas? The request was perfectly reasonable for a freelance journalist, but it had the intended effect of drawing a crowd toward David's painting and toward Dr. Westfield, who now found herself surrounded by witnesses and unable to call for security without creating a scene. Meanwhile, Sarah had detected the crisis through the hidden surveillance network Michael had installed. Her modified smartphone was monitoring all electronic communications in the building, and she'd intercepted Dr. Westfield's aborted attempt to trigger an alert. More concerning, she'd also detected elevated radio chatter among the Waldorf's security staff. Someone else had noticed something suspicious. Sarah quickly sent a coded text message to the group's secure network. Situation escalating. Prepare for early extraction. The message reached Tommy just as he was following Mrs. Eleanor Blackwell toward a private study where she'd promised to show him Harrison's private files that would either cement his cover identity or expose him as a fraud. The timing couldn't have been worse. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Blackwell," Tommy said, checking his phone with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to urgent business calls. "I need to handle something quickly. Family emergency." Mrs. Blackwell's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What kind of family emergency? I thought you said you had no other family besides Harrison's legacy." Tommy realized his mistake immediately. His cover story had established him as someone with no living relatives except the Blackwell family. A family emergency from any other source would blow his entire identity. "You're right," he said, thinking quickly. "It's not exactly family. It's the gallery owner I was telling you about. The one who's been helping me navigate re-entering American society. She's having some kind of crisis with potential donors, and since I'm hoping to make connections in the art world." It was a weak explanation, and Mrs. Blackwell's expression suggested she wasn't buying it. But before she could press further, the lights in the ballroom suddenly dimmed, and a voice echoed through the sound system. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please?" The voice belonged to Marcus Thompson. Every conversation in the ballroom stopped as guests turned toward the large screens that had descended from the ceiling. Marcus appeared via video link from his hospital bed, looking frailer than when the seven had last seen him, but his eyes burned with the intensity of a man making his final stand. "My name is Marcus Thompson, and 30 years ago I was a young journalist who discovered that some of the most respected people in America were running a child trafficking and experimentation ring out of the Riverside Children's Home." The reaction in the ballroom was immediate and electric. Gasps of shock from legitimate guests who had no idea what their charity supported. Urgent whispers from Heritage Foundation members who were trying to process what was happening. And the subtle but unmistakable movement of security personnel toward exits and communication devices. "I was forced to bury that story to protect my family," Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength. "But tonight, the truth finally comes home." The screens switched to display documents, photographs, and recorded conversations that the seven infiltrators had gathered over the past few hours. Audio of Senator Hartwell discussing discreet charitable work. Video of Dr. Chen explaining memory modification protocols. Financial records showing payments to offshore accounts. And most damning of all, the surveillance footage from the private dining room, where the Heritage Foundation's leadership had casually discussed their plans to acquire 43 new child victims. Dr. Westfield released David's wrist and stared at the screens in horror. Not because she was shocked by the revelations, she knew better than anyone what the Heritage Foundation did, but because she realized that her recognition of David had been part of a carefully orchestrated trap. "You," she whispered. "All of you. You're all here." David nodded grimly. 7 children who were supposed to have died in that fire. 7 witnesses you thought you'd silenced forever, and 7 people who spent 30 years learning how to destroy you. Around the ballroom, chaos was erupting. Legitimate guests were demanding explanations from Heritage Foundation board members. Security personnel were trying to shut down the audio-visual system while simultaneously searching for the infiltrators. And in the midst of it all, 7 survivors of Riverside were executing their extraction plan. Jessica had positioned herself near Senator Hartwell when Marcus's broadcast began, and she watched with satisfaction as his face went through a range of emotions: shock, recognition, rage, and finally, the cold calculation of a politician trying to minimize damage. "This is all fabricated," Hartwell announced to the guests around him. "Marcus Thompson is a dying man with delusions of grandeur. These documents are obviously forged." "Are they?" Jessica asked sweetly, her cover identity as Victoria Sinclair now completely abandoned. "Because I recorded our conversation earlier this evening. The one where you offered to discuss the aspects of your work that require discretion in exchange for my 8-figure donation." She held up her phone, which was already streaming their recorded conversation to the same broadcast network Marcus was using. Hartwell's voice filled the ballroom. "There are aspects of our work that require discretion. The most effective charitable work often operates away from public scrutiny." The senator's face went white as he realized that every incriminating word he'd spoken was being broadcast live to news networks across the country. Michael had abandoned his tech support disguise and was now working frantically to maintain the broadcast connection while Heritage Foundation security tried to cut their communication links. His years of mechanical problem-solving served him well, as he rerouted data streams through backup systems, cellular networks, and even the building's own security cameras. "They're trying to jam our signals," he reported through his earpiece. "But I've got redundant pathways through 7 different networks. They'd have to shut down the entire Manhattan communications grid to stop this broadcast." The twins were working together to document the chaos, with Amanda conducting impromptu interviews with shocked guests, while Ashley captured the Heritage Foundation members' increasingly desperate attempts to control the narrative. Their footage was being streamed live alongside Marcus's revelations, creating a real-time documentary of a criminal conspiracy unraveling. "Mrs. Kane," Amanda called out to the federal judge who was trying to slip toward an exit. "As a member of the Heritage Foundation's board, would you like to comment on these allegations of child trafficking and memory modification?" Judge Kane spun around, her judicial composure cracking under the pressure. "This is a setup. You people are terrorists." "Terrorists?" Ashley asked, zooming in on the judge's face. "We're survivors of the crimes your organization committed. Does seeking justice for child victims make us terrorists?" The judge's response was captured by cameras that were broadcasting to millions of viewers. "You were supposed to stay buried. We gave you new lives, new identities. You should have been grateful." It was a complete admission of guilt, delivered in front of witnesses and recorded for posterity. Sarah had positioned herself at the main technology station, where she was simultaneously maintaining their broadcast capabilities and downloading every file from the Heritage Foundation's internal servers. Her modified equipment was working at maximum capacity, copying decades of records, financial transactions, and operational documents. "I've got their entire database," she reported. "Client lists, facility locations, staff rosters, financial records going back to 1995. Everything." But even as she worked, Sarah could see Heritage Foundation security closing in on their positions. The organization's protective instincts were kicking in, and they were preparing to eliminate the threats rather than allow their exposure to continue. Tommy found himself in the most dangerous position of all. Mrs. Blackwell had realized that His family emergency coincided perfectly with the beginning of Marcus Thompson's broadcast, and she was no longer buying his cover story. "You're one of them," she said, backing away from him with growing alarm. "One of the Riverside children. Harrison told me they were all dead." Harrison lied about a lot of things, Tommy replied, no longer bothering to maintain his refined accent, including the fact that he helped cover up the attempted murder of 7 children. Mrs. Blackwell was reaching for her purse, and Tommy could see the outline of what was probably a small handgun. Rich people in criminal enterprises, he'd learned, often carried protection. "You're not taking down this organization," she said, her voice carrying the cold authority of someone accustomed to eliminating problems. "Too many important people depend on our services. You 7 made a mistake coming here tonight." "Actually," Tommy said, smiling with the confidence of someone who'd spent 3 years learning to read dangerous situations, "you made the mistake. You assumed we came here alone." The ballroom's main doors burst open as federal agents flooded into the space, their weapons drawn and badges clearly visible. Behind them came Detective Sarah Rodriguez, the same detective Marcus had called 30 years ago, now leading a joint FBI-NYPD task force that had been standing by for exactly this moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," Detective Rodriguez announced, her voice carrying over the chaos, "this is a federal investigation. All Heritage Foundation board members and staff are to remain where you are for questioning." The trap had been even more elaborate than the Heritage Foundation had realized. Marcus Thompson hadn't just spent 30 years gathering evidence. He'd spent 30 years building relationships with law enforcement officials who could act on that evidence. The broadcast wasn't just about public exposure. It was about creating undeniable probable cause for arrests that had been prepared years in advance. As federal agents moved through the ballroom, reading rights and placing Heritage Foundation members in custody, the 7 survivors of Riverside finally allowed themselves to believe that their nightmare was really ending. But Dr. Westfield, now cornered and facing life in prison, had one final card to play. "You think this ends anything?" she called out to David as agents approached her. "We have facilities you'll never find, children you'll never save, and people in positions so high that your evidence will disappear before it reaches a courtroom." She pulled a small device from her purse, not a weapon, but something far more dangerous, a dead man's switch connected to incendiary devices throughout the building. "If I'm going down," she said with the cold calculation of someone who'd spent 30 years destroying lives, "I'm taking all of you with me, including the evidence you think you've gathered." The ballroom went silent as everyone realized they were seconds away from an explosion that would kill everyone present and destroy all the evidence they'd gathered. But Dr. Westfield had made one crucial mistake. She'd forgotten that 7 survivors of Riverside had spent 30 years learning to expect betrayal and prepare for the worst-case scenario. David smiled grimly as he looked at the woman who'd tried to steal his memories as a child. "Fire doesn't scare us anymore," he said quietly. "We've already survived your worst." And with that, he lunged forward, gambling everything on one final act of courage that would determine whether justice would finally be served or whether the Heritage Foundation would claim 7 more victims to add to their decades of crimes. Time slowed to a crawl as David lunged toward Dr. Margaret Westfield, his mind calculating angles and distances with the precision of someone who'd spent 30 years expecting death to come without warning. The dead man's switch in her hand was connected to enough incendiary devices to turn the Waldorf Astoria's ballroom into an inferno that would make the Riverside Children's Home fire look like a campfire. But David Rodriguez, no longer Danny, the frightened child, no longer Daniel Morrison, the fake artist, had learned something crucial during his years of survival. Sometimes the only way to defeat monsters was to become more dangerous than they were. His tackle caught Dr. Westfield round the waist, sending them both crashing into the display of Heritage Foundation awards and accolades. Crystal trophies shattered around them as they hit the floor, but David's focus remained locked on the device in her hand. He'd seen enough improvised explosives during his time on the streets to know that dead man's switches required constant pressure. Release the button and everything went up in flames. "You can't stop this," Dr. Westfield hissed, struggling to maintain her grip on the device while fighting off David's attempts to disarm her. "Even if you kill me, there are others. Facilities you'll never find. Children who are already too broken to save." "Maybe," David grunted, managing to pin her wrist against the marble floor. "But we'll save the ones we can, and we'll make sure the world knows what you people really are." Around them, chaos reigned as federal agents tried to clear the ballroom, while simultaneously preventing panic that could cause a stampede. Detective Rodriguez was barking orders into her radio, calling for bomb disposal experts and evacuation teams. But everyone in the room understood the terrible mathematics of the situation. Dr. Westfield's finger was the only thing standing between life and death for over 300 people. It was Tommy who provided the solution, his 3 years in prison having taught him things about violence and leverage that elite boarding schools never covered. Moving with the fluid grace of someone who'd learned to fight in environments where hesitation meant death, he approached Dr. Westfield from her blind side. "Doc," he said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather rather than mass murder, "you're holding that switch wrong. See, the thing about explosive devices is that they're designed by people who understand psychology. They know that in a crisis, your grip strength actually decreases due to adrenaline." Dr. Westfield's eyes darted toward him, confusion momentarily, overriding her desperation. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that you're so focused on keeping that button pressed that you haven't noticed I'm now close enough to do this." Tommy's hand moved with lethal precision, striking a pressure point in Dr. Westfield's neck that caused her entire arm to go numb. The dead man's switch clattered across the marble floor, and for one heart-stopping moment, everyone in the ballroom waited for the explosion that would end their lives. Nothing happened. Tommy picked up the device and examined it with the clinical detachment of someone who'd learned to read people and situations for survival. After a moment, he began to laugh, a sound that carried both relief and bitter amusement. "It's fake," he announced to the room. "The whole thing is a dummy device. No explosives, no radio transmitter, nothing but plastic and electronics that look impressive but don't actually do anything." Dr. Westfield's face crumpled as she realized her final gambit had failed. "That's impossible. I tested the system myself." "You tested a decoy system." Sarah's voice cut through the confusion as she approached with her laptop. "I've been monitoring all electronic signals in this building since we arrived. There are no active explosive devices anywhere in the Waldorf Astoria." She turned her screen toward the crowd, displaying a comprehensive scan of radio frequencies and electronic signatures throughout the building. "Dr. Westfield, you've been carrying a prop for the past 6 months. Someone in your organization has been planning to eliminate you as a liability." The revelation sent a shockwave through the remaining Heritage Foundation members. Their own leadership had prepared to sacrifice Dr. Westfield, and probably others, to protect the organization's core operations. The paranoia and mistrust that kept criminal conspiracies together was also what ultimately destroyed them. Senator Hartwell, already in federal custody, laughed bitterly from across the room. "Margaret, you always were too trusting. Did you really think the board would put real explosives in the hands of someone they considered a loose cannon?" As federal agents secured Dr. Westfield and the other Heritage Foundation members, the 7 survivors of Riverside found themselves standing together in the center of the ballroom, watching 30 years of planning finally come to fruition. But Their victory was interrupted by a commotion near the main entrance. Marcus Thompson, despite his terminal condition and against all medical advice, was being wheeled into the ballroom by his medical team. He looked like death itself, pale, gaunt, barely able to sit upright, but his eyes burned with the intensity of a man who'd lived to see his life's work completed. "I had to see it for myself," he said, as his wheelchair approached the group. "Had to make sure it was really over." Detective Rodriguez intercepted him, her expression mixing professional concern with personal respect. "Mr. Thompson, you should be in the hospital. The doctor said I'd be dead 6 months ago," Marcus interrupted with a weak smile. "I've been running on borrowed time and pure stubbornness for longer than anyone expected, but I couldn't die without seeing these 7 people reclaim their lives." He looked at each of the survivors in turn, his gaze carrying the weight of 3 decades of guilt, planning, and desperate hope. "I know I can't give you back your childhoods. I can't undo the trauma or erase the years of struggling to survive, but I hope tonight proves that your suffering wasn't meaningless." Jessica stepped forward, her designer gown now torn and stained from the evening's chaos, but her posture radiating a confidence that 30 years of hiding had never quite extinguished. "Marcus, what you've given us isn't just justice. It's the knowledge that we were worth fighting for, that our lives mattered enough for someone to spend 3 decades planning this moment." "You were always worth fighting for," Marcus replied, his voice growing weaker but his conviction unwavering. "I just took too long to become the man who could actually do something about it." The medical team was growing increasingly concerned about Marcus's condition, but he waved off their attempts to return him to the hospital. "There's something else," he said, looking specifically at Victoria Blackwood, who had been quietly documenting everything for the legal proceedings to come. "Victoria, the documents." Victoria approached with a leather portfolio that she placed on a nearby table. "As we discussed, Mr. Thompson." She opened the portfolio to reveal a series of legal documents that would transform the survivors' lives, as dramatically as the evening's revelations had transformed their understanding of their past. "Thompson Industries," Marcus explained, "has been restructured as a charitable foundation dedicated to fighting human trafficking and supporting survivors of institutional abuse. The entire company, all assets, all subsidiaries, all financial resources will be controlled by a board of directors consisting of you 7. The implications hit them like a physical blow. They were inheriting not just Marcus's wealth, but his entire empire, an empire that had been specifically designed as a weapon against organizations like the Heritage Foundation. "That's..." Sarah started, then stopped, her analytical mind struggling to process the magnitude of what they were being offered. "That's approximately $4.2 billion in combined assets," Victoria supplied helpfully, "along with controlling interests in 47 companies across 12 industries, real estate holdings in 8 countries, and information networks that reach into the highest levels of government and business." Michael laughed, the sound carrying disbelief rather than humor. "You're making us billionaires? I'm giving you the tools to make sure what happened to you never happens to anyone else," Marcus corrected. "Money is just a weapon. How you use it determines whether it serves justice or perpetuates injustice." Amanda and Ashley exchanged one of their wordless communications before Amanda spoke for both of them. "There are other children out there. Right now. Other facilities we haven't found yet. 47 active locations across 13 countries, according to the files Sarah downloaded," Tommy added, his street-smart mind already thinking tactically. "Most of them probably don't even know the Heritage Foundation has been compromised yet." "Then we have work to do," David said quietly, his artist's hands already sketching plans in the air. "But this time, we're not going in as victims or survivors. We're going in as the people with the power to shut them down permanently." Detective Rodriguez approached the group, her expression mixing professional satisfaction with personal admiration. The federal task force will be coordinating with international law enforcement to raid those facilities simultaneously. But we'll need your help, your testimony, your insights into how these operations work, your ability to identify victims who might not even remember their victims. You'll have it, Jessica promised. All of it. As dawn broke over Manhattan, the Waldorf Astoria had been transformed into the epicenter of the largest human trafficking investigation in American history. Federal agents, international law enforcement officials, and victim advocacy groups were coordinating rescue operations that would unfold across multiple continents over the following weeks. The Heritage Foundation's 30-year reign of terror was ending not with a whimper, but with a coordinated global response that would free hundreds of victims and ensure that the organization's leadership spent the rest of their lives in prison. But for 7 people who had started life as abandoned children, survived systematic abuse, and spent 30 years believing they were alone in the world, the most important transformation was personal. They had found each other. They had found the truth. And they had found the power to make sure their suffering served a purpose beyond mere survival. Marcus Thompson died peacefully in his hospital bed 3 days later, surrounded by the 7 people he'd spent half his life trying to save. His last words, according to the nurses, were, "The story finally has the right ending." 6 months later, the Thompson Foundation's first annual report documented the rescue of 347 children from trafficking operations, the successful prosecution of 89 individuals in 12 countries, and the establishment of treatment centers specifically designed to help victims recover suppressed memories and rebuild their lives. But the report's most significant statistic was simpler. 0. 0 children had been successfully trafficked through any Heritage Foundation network since the night of the Waldorf Astoria Gala. The organization that had operated for over 30 years, that had seemed untouchable and eternal, had been completely dismantled in less than 6 months. The 7 survivors had learned something that their childhood tormentors never understood. People who have lost everything have nothing left to lose, and that makes them the most dangerous opponents of all. They had been stolen children who became broken adults who transformed into avenging angels. And in the end, they had proven that some debts can only be paid in full, no matter how long it takes to collect them. The Riverside Children's Home fire had been meant to bury their story forever. Instead, it had forged 7 people into the weapon that would ultimately bring down the very system that had tried to destroy them. Justice, it turned out, was not a destination. It was a choice that had to be made again and again by people brave enough to stand up to monsters and wise enough to know that the fight never really ends. But for the first time in 30 years, 7 survivors of unspeakable crimes could sleep peacefully, knowing that they had finally come home to themselves and that they had made the world a safer place for every child who would never have to experience what they had endured. The nightmare was over. The healing could finally begin, and somewhere in offices and boardrooms around the world, other monsters looked over their shoulders and wondered if 7 avenging angels might be coming for them next. They were right to wonder. The Thompson Foundation was just getting started. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.